Have you seen what happened in Europe with the farmers?
I've been watching that, yes.
Yeah, it seems like they, at least temporarily, have won.
They have won, but...
Let's explain what we're talking about.
All right. Well, maybe you should explain what you've seen. I've watched massive protests of farmers who are increasingly angry and organized about regulations that make farming increasingly difficult, unproductive, and unprofitable.
If I was a conspiratorially minded person, what I would say is what they're trying to do is take over these farms. And the best way to do that is to enact legislation and rules that limit their profitable. Well, first of all, farms are always very difficult to run. They're very difficult to maintain profitability. They struggle. And it's a terrible shame that the people that provide us the thing that we need to survive, ultimately food, that we've done something to these people to make it more difficult for them to do it while it's already insanely difficult. It requires incredible hours, incredibly difficult, highly stressful. There's so many moving pieces just to provide food for all these people. And they started enacting legislation to limit the amount of fertilizer they're allowed to use, to limit the amount of animals they have. I know in Ireland they proposed something where they want to kill a certain amount of the cows because they're saying that the cows produce methane. It's fucking insane. It's not scientific. It's not something voted on. It's not something agreed upon by scientists, biologists, certainly not debated when you're talking about regenerative farming practices, like people that have provided significant options for farming the way, like whatever the issues that they have, where they can actually sequester carbon in the soil and make these farms carbon neutral. It's been demonstrated. It's not theory. It's been done in America. Polyphase farms, White Oaks pastures are two great examples of that, but there's many regenerative farms. It can be done. And for whatever reason, they have decided to enact these harsh limitations on these farmers' abilities to provide food for people. Cynically, when I look at something like that, I'm like, I think what they would do is do that, cripple the farmers' ability to make money. The farms go under, they take over, they control the food supply.
Right. And I hear you working overtime not to see what's in front of you, and I agree.
I'm just being fair.
Yeah,
I'm just making it as I'm trying to steel man it as much as possible.
Right, but if you take the objective of the game as profit, it's not exactly clear what the end game is. If you take the objective of the game as power and control,
yeah,
then it's pretty clear.
That's the best way to control the food supply. I mean, you just put the farmers out of business.
Who's going to challenge you
right.
if their ability to eat requires them to embrace whatever nonsense
yes.
you're feeding them?
And all you would have to do is start some sort of famine and just make it very difficult for people to get food, and people panic. And
right.
And when people panic, especially people with limited resources and limited financial ability, they concede.
They do.
And that's what we saw during the pandemic. I mean, it was a great test run to see how much control you can really have over people as soon as you have some sort of major issue that everyone globally has to deal with.
Right. Of course, simultaneously, they make it difficult for those of us who recognize what is unfolding to make ourselves self-sufficient. So you see weird regulations against, ancient things like unpasteurized dairy, right?
Yeah.
As if that was some major threat to people or something that you should override their ability to judge for themselves. But the pattern of seeking power and control, if you imagine an antagonist, rent-seeking elites, for lack of a better term, and you imagine that they are, however they get there, completely amoral with respect to us normies. I don't know that they hate us, but they don't care if we live or die. If you imagine that, then you begin to see that major patterns point in the same direction, right? This attempt to control agriculture, which suggests some later chapter in which hunger is going to be used to keep people in line, is consistent with vaccine mandates that were issued in the military, which drove out all of the people who would naturally resist immoral orders, creating a more compliant force. Now, you could imagine that that was an accident. You could imagine that public health officials let their fears get away from them, and they mandated these things out of a misunderstanding of the protection of that force. But I think the most parsimonious explanation is that actually a force built of people who take whatever orders you give them is desired for some scenario we have yet to see.
So what happened in Europe was these farmers started fighting back. They started dumping manure everywhere, and they started blockading and doing all these things to protest. And apparently, at least temporarily, they've won. Now, what kind of repercussions they're going to face because of this is what's going to get really weird, and that'll be very telling to see what they do to attack these farmers. But it seems like part of the problem was the public was unanimously in favor of the farmers. No one thought any of this stuff made sense. No one thought that killing all these cows made any sense. No one thought that limiting the amount of fertilizer these guys could use or the way these guys can produce food made any sense. And I think most people fundamentally recognize that farming is not just difficult, but it's fragile. That they don't have a lot of wiggle room. And so for these people to rise up the way they did, that's very courageous.